Hello, welcome to Podsongs. I'm Jack Stafford, and I interview inspiring people in service to others as inspiration for a new song. Now, I didn't know that America has a third political party after Democrats and Republicans. But there we go. I'm here to learn. They're called Libertarians, and they bridge the divide between the two. You could say the best bits of both. If you're a libertarian, you would say that. He's a senior editor at Reason magazine, which is kind of the voice of the party. He's also written a book about the radicals in the Zillenial generation and their reactions to the Trump presidency. So there's a lot to talk about with Robby Soave. Thanks for sending me a copy of your book. It looks fascinating. I've not finished it yet.
That'd been impressive if you had.
So you set it out to be a psychological profile of the Zillenial, the Generation Z millennial activist, an origin story for the selfie generation's social change agents, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, Me Too feminists, etc. And then you went round university campuses and did interviews and did a lot of research.
Yep, that's right. Just wanted to talk to young people about their tactics, their activism, because I think, we've noticed, or even the broader public has noticed, a lot more activism aimed at choking off conversation, activism aimed at stopping people from speaking if those people are deemed harmful. And I wanted to kind of understand where that was coming from.
So why, of all the subjects to write about, why did you pick this one?
Oh, I've sort of been a writer about higher education trends for a while, and the kind of cultural side of that has become very interesting. I'm a big free speech guy. I'm a libertarian First Amendment advocate, and I was seeing, and historically, the left or progressives have been very in sync with what I think about free speech. That even horrible people get free speech rights, etc. And in the last few years, that has shifted a little bit, where there were more people on campus who are otherwise liberal or left-leaning people saying that, well, you shouldn't speak if what you have to say is hate speech or something like that, which was a little bit of a change. So I wanted to understand that better.
Yeah, because the free speech is the First Amendment. It seems pretty bedrock.
It's wildly comprehensive. So we don't have, you'll often hear this. Sometimes people will say, well, free speech is different than hate speech or something like that. And it actually isn't. There's no definition of hate speech. There's no Supreme Court case where a court has said, well, you can say this, but you can't say this if it's hate speech. The Supreme Court has recognized just a very few exceptions to broad free speech. You can't incite people to violence. You can't engage in libel or defamation, a couple other things. But the Supreme Court, it's this comprehensive. The Supreme Court said, and it wasn't a close decision, that, the Westboro Baptist Church, which is this kind of insane cult religious group, it's a hate group, they said they can stand on the street during the funerals for military service people and shout obscenities at them that, they're glad they were killed, etc. The Supreme Court said they have a First Amendment right to do that. So if that is allowed under the First Amendment, basically anything that is that you just kind of are offended by in your normal life, that's probably going to be protected too. The protections are just, and they've grown broader over time. If you went back 100 years ago, you could find a court case where the Supreme Court said distributing leaflets, pamphlets opposing the entrance into World War I. They said, well, that's like yelling fire in a crowded theater. That's gonna make people too unruly. So you can't do that. That's actually the genesis of the fire in a crowded theater metaphor, which is obviously bad, because now today's Supreme Court would never agree with that. They would say, of course you can yell fire in a crowded theater if there's a fire. That metaphor doesn't work. You can absolutely oppose World War I or any war or whatever. So it really has. We have a very well established norm of near total free speech.
So there's no condition that you could. The most extreme person could come into university and speak. You wouldn't. Is there any way you personally would draw the line, or you're a complete libertarian?
Well, first of all, where I might draw the line, in any case, wouldn't matter, because I know it's very obvious where the Supreme Court draws the line, and all of these things, especially if we're talking about a public university campus, it could not be clearer that they would say, yeah, this person gets to speak. Me personally, I think what the Supreme Court has decided is pretty good. I think when you start saying people can't speak if what they have to say is hateful or offensive, that's a slippery slope. You can run into problems. What if the offensive thing is true? I mean, let's go back historically. There would have been times where saying something bad about the king or the religious authorities could get you executed or burned at the stake or worse. Even having a quarrel, having something unkind to say about your neighbors could result in a duel or like a clash of families or something. It's only, since the Enlightenment in the last, 200-300 years that we've kind of that we've decided as a society that I may disagree with what you say. I may be deeply offended. I might hate what you have to say, but you have the right to say it, and I'm not going to retaliate against you with formal sanction or with violence. And I think that's a very, very, very good norm. It's not natural. It's not native to humanity. It's something we picked up after a long time, and I'm really worried about retreating on it at all.
So when you were in university, is this what you saw this going against? You saw a lot of.
I went to the University of Michigan. I was there in 2006, 2010. And back then, I saw sort of a broad defense still of free speech from the students on campus, from the faculty. We defended, the students defended, for instance, the Iranian president, Mohammed Ahmadinejad, when he was going to come speak I believe at Columbia University. We being the student paper, published editorials defending that. There were offensive speakers who would occasionally come to campus. There was no question that they had a First Amendment right to be there. And of course, you have a First Amendment right to criticize them, to respond to their speech with speech of your own, as long as you're not, completely preventing them from being able to talk at all or using violence against them. That's the perfectly fine way to address that. I started noticing subsequently to that, so I graduated in 2010, it seemed like it got dramatically more in like the default was censorship from the point of view of the students, or at least some of the very activist-minded students. And actually, I talk to professors, again, who are very liberal professors, who tell me they're afraid of their students, that their students will file reports to get them in trouble if the professor says something that offends them in class. And that's very worrying, actually. I think professors should have, basically total freedom to run their classes the way they want. There's some applicable laws, they can't discriminate against their students, etc. But they broadly, they have to have the freedom to challenge their students, to tell them things that make them uncomfortable, and they're actually very fearful that they're losing that right.
Yeah, I've heard it said that the only way to educate someone is to upset their views and agitate it so that they can grow. No.
Yeah, absolutely. And some things you have to learn are not pleasant. But you have to learn them. If you're learning to be a medical student, you might have to. I wouldn't want to do it because I don't like the sight of blood. But if you're in that field, you have to learn that, right? We can't just say, well, you don't have to learn this because you have some trauma for this. Kind of sidestepping people's or catering to people's discomfort levels at all times is not always good. I've heard from law professors, for instance, who tell me they're fearful of teaching the law as it relates to sexual assault, because they're afraid that if there are students in the classroom who've experienced that, they could re-traumatize them or something of that nature. And of course, I understand that we want to protect students, but not teaching that aspect of the law would have horrible consequences for actually bringing people to justice who perpetrate that harm, for having educated judges and juries, etc. It's great that we take sexual assault much more seriously as a society, as a legal profession, in part because it's been taught So that's like an example to me of almost giving up on knowledge because we're afraid of offending people.
So what are the underlying reasons for this? Why is this happening?
Yeah, so it's very, I think when you define safety so broadly as to include people's mental and emotional well-being, not just their safety from physical harm, which is how safety is historically described, you give license to do a lot of rather silly things, which is not to say that people's mental and emotional well-being is obviously extremely important, but hitting someone in the face is violence. Saying words that hurt someone, it might be bad. There might be various discussions we'd have about it, but it's not violence in the same way. But it seems to me that a lot of young people think of those things as similar, as falling along the same spectrum of behavior. And thus, if you're going to come to campus and say something that is going to make me feel unwell, or is going to make someone else on campus that I'm sympathetic to or allied with feel unwell, it seems like the students, it is what they've said in their conversations to me, are saying that they think they have a right then, almost like a self-defense right, to stop that speech from occurring.
Okay. Do you see it from their point of view? Do you sympathize?
Well, I certainly sympathize with the goal of avoiding unnecessary emotional harm. Everybody wants to avoid that. It's especially. I mean, this has been such a trying year for so many people. The mental health crisis going on because of the pandemic. I think it's good that people talk more openly about what depresses or troubles them than they would have in generations past. If you go back, you have people just kind of suffering in silence because especially men don't want to talk about their emotions, that kind of thing. I think it's good that people are much more, especially young people, are much more open to discussing these things. Almost gone a little bit too far. What I've noticed, I mean, among some college students, there's it's not just I'm open to discussing my feelings, but it's you have to present as emotionally harmed in order to be taken seriously. I've noticed a disturbing trend of people trying to associate themselves with mental illness or unwellness because you get a certain kind of power and authority if you say that. Not every college student has PTSD. There's just no way. It's not possible. But I've heard from professors who will tell me that every single student in their classroom, and these are well-to-do students at affluent liberal arts universities, saying they all have PTSD, so none of them can do their homework because it's too traumatizing. I'm like, that sounds a little manipulative to me. I don't think that's quite the case.
I heard you say in the book that Trump getting elected was the most traumatic event in their lives.
Yeah, a lot of students told me that, and I'm no fan of Trump myself, so I certainly was not a supporter. I think there might be a difference between opposing his policies or something and treating it like mental health trauma that he was elected. I mean, to the extent that on campuses they had coloring books and Play-Doh and like emotional support animals and classes were canceled at campus after campus after campus the day after you won. There are schools that didn't cancel classes after 9/11, and they canceled classes after Trump won. I'm not trying to downplay if you don't like Trump how horrifying that was, but it seems like it's almost sort of reveling in your own emotional weakness to respond that way.
Yeah. So where are you? What are your own beliefs? Where do you stand on Trump?
Sure. I'm a libertarian. I support smaller government kind of the whole way around. So I mean, in very crude terms, that used to mean I would agree with Republicans on taxes and regulation and spending, and I would agree with Democrats on sort of social issues and foreign policy. Now everything's so scrambled, you don't even know what side believes what. The Republicans are big, they want trade restrictions and immigration restrictions, which are things they didn't used to want, which libertarians want the opposite of that. And some liberals have gone so far on other issues that I don't agree. So it's confusing times, but Trump has not delivered, I would say, favorable results for libertarians in general. The one area, I guess, if I could point to things where I agree with Trump on would be foreign policy. or at least the rhetoric, he espoused on not starting new wars, not doing nation building. That I agree with all of that. I wish he had gone much further in getting our troops out of foreign countries. The fact that he didn't start a new war is, if I'm trying to make the most positive case for Trump's presidency, these are the lines along which I would draw it. I think obviously many of his other policies and his personal behavior, especially how he's behaved since losing the election, has just been so destructive and so shameful. I live 2 blocks from the Capitol. I went to cover it when the mob ransacked it.
Really?
It is absolutely clear to me they did that because of the things that Trump himself said. So I have a hard time not. I certainly believe he should have been impeached over that, because it's so the crime at the Capitol that happened is just one of the most, shocking public spectacles I've ever witnessed. Horrifying. People actually died. A mob attacked the Capitol. They smashed the windows. They climbed over the building. This should have never happened. Trump absolutely is morally to blame for it occurring.
Where were you watching it from?
So I went down to cover it. I circled the building. I saw them trying to enter various chambers. I saw them smash windows, and so there were thousands of people there, and the vast majority not doing anything illegal, just doing First Amendment protected activity. They have every right to march to the Capitol. Mm-hmm. They have every right to support a political cause I don't agree with, and that was fine. But there were several hundred people, probably, it's difficult to estimate the exact size, but certainly more than 100 people, and perhaps several hundred people, who attacked police officers, smashed windows, ransacked the inside of the building, made the legislators fear for their lives. There was tear gas. There was clouds of tear gas just everywhere. I've never been tear gassed before, and I wasn't, no one tear gassed me in the face, but I encountered a cloud of tear gas. It was horrible. And certainly it was a windy day. It was blowing back on the crowd of people who were actually not doing anything wrong. It was a truly appalling day in our nation's history. And again, I don't see how you could not. Certainly, I don't know that Trump is. I wouldn't say he incited it in the criminal sense. For criminal incite, so incitement is not First Amendment protected speech. You can't incite a riot, but according to the Supreme Court, it has to meet several definitions for what rises to incitement. I don't know that he would clear the criminal threshold, but impeachment is just a political sort of statement that this was behavior completely unacceptable for a public official, and he absolutely qualifies under that bar.
Yeah, we all watch with disbelief in Europe. I mean, this is America.
Yeah. And I'm not I am not a knee-jerk critic of President Trump. I just told you, there are things I like about his presidency. I have often thought some of the criticisms from the media are hyperbolic or they're overbroad. So I'm not someone who thinks Trump is the devil or who has said that, every time something happens. So hopefully my criticism has some weight in this case, because I think this was more appalling in some sense than anything else that has occurred over the last 4 years.
Because it's funny, libertarian. You write for Reason magazine. You're one of the editors, and is there a party for libertarians? Because we obviously know Democrats and Republicans.
Yep, there is the Libertarian Party. It is the most successful third party in America currently.
Oh, really?
We have a presidential candidate every year. Our candidate this year was Jo Jorgensen. I voted for her. We have probably the political figure most associated with libertarianism currently is a representative called Justin Amash, who has just left Congress. He didn't run for re-election, and he was a Republican and who changed his voter affiliation to Libertarian because he was so kind of disgusted with the Republicans, violating all their commitments to their supposed commitments to libertarianism. So unfortunately, the American system is brutally punishing to third parties. And it's the nature of the system, because we don't have a parliamentary system. We have just such a winner take all system. So it doesn't matter even if you have, if you're a third party and 10% of the voters support you, that gets you nothing. That gets you zero because it's not proportional. It's a majority. Even in the presidential vote, right? It doesn't matter if 10% of, I don't know, Michigan voters want a libertarian, that translates to 0 seats in Congress or stake in the presidency. It's just whoever gets 51% of Michigan's votes is who Michigan is sending its electoral votes for. So our system really, by design, unintentionally or intentionally, is the two-party system is a monolith. There's a reason it's been around virtually for the entire history of the country, and it is so hard to get around.
So how many votes did libertarians get in the last election?
We got what was our we get about I don't remember exactly. I should Google it while I'm talking to you. We got more than 1 million votes. Our best, I think we got 3 or 4% of the vote in 2016, which was pretty good because there was so much discussed with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. This time you'll hear from a lot of people who'd be like, well, I would vote libertarian, but the election is so important and it feels like your vote doesn't matter unless you're voting for Trump or Biden. There's a lot of concern that you're throwing away your vote because no third-party candidate can ever win.
So what would be the manifesto of the libertarians?
Libertarians are for limited government and personal responsibility. So we want less taxes, less regulation, but also we want to leave people alone. We want the social policy to reflect individual freedom, and we want a non-militaristic foreign policy. Many of these ideas are broadly popular, are even ideas that Republicans and Democrats have. Like, we want to work with very progressive Democrats on criminal justice reform, on getting rid of ICE, on letting immigrants come to this country and work productively. These are all things we share with the left. But then we want what many Republicans want in terms of not having a punitive tax system, making it very easy for businesses to open up, not taxing people into oblivion. So it's animated by what is, in our view, a consistent philosophy, which is that the government just should not have more power. Yeah. So you should have the power, not the government.
I heard you talking on another podcast that libertarians, they're very divisive because if you elect someone, they kind of immediately resign. I don't want to be a government. They're kind of you're anti-elections kind of things, or anti.
Yeah, well, that's the difficult, right. Our view is that the government should have less to do, and we're almost even distrustful of people who seek political office. I mean, I wish more people were distrustful of people who seek political office.
Nobody that wants to run for office should be allowed to run for office.
Exactly. Yeah. No one seeks power, with rare exception. No one seeks power with the idea of giving it up. That's like straight from George Orwell, right? Power is its own end. You don't assume control of the government in order to shut it down. You assume control of the government to become some kind of dictator.
Yeah. You get a taste of power and you think, no, I'll give it back, it up.
And so much of it is hard it is really hard. We have these massive federal bureaucracies. Our response to the pandemic has been so bad, but not. It's hard to find like the individual to blame because it's not really. I mean, there are certainly cases where certain individuals are to fault, but the left will say it's all Trump's fault. The right will say no, Trump is perfect. He is God. He has never erred, etc. But I'm thinking like, well, the FDA and the CDC made so many mistakes that are institutional failures of massive bureaucracies. We couldn't get. I mean, there are therapies, there are vaccines approved in Europe, approved in the UK, that we took weeks longer to approve or haven't even approved. And I'm sorry, everything that scientists have said is safe in Europe and the UK, we should be able to have. We shouldn't need an additional regulation or verification, right? That's so easy. That's so obvious to me. If your scientists say it's fine, then our citizens should be able to take it. But we have a massive federal bureaucracy that says, no, we have to decide if you're allowed to have these therapies. And they just take forever to do it. And literally, thousands of people dying every day. So I find that very frustrating.
It's a massive institutional failure. I spoke to Eric Topol, one of the most respected doctors in America, and he said that they had the home testing kits for COVID back in April. They had them ready, and there's now 21, but they're not available.
Yeah, and they messed them up initially because the CDC and the FDA said we don't want. People came up with tests and they said no, you're not allowed to use these because we're worried they might not be accurate enough. Which was true that they weren't perfectly accurate, but the issue is like that's not that important. We need people to be. If you occasionally get it wrong, oh well. But like you need to. We needed to test people on such a massive scale. I mean, test them twice if the tests aren't accurate enough.
They're $1 each, so.
Right. That's so much better an approach than striving for perfect accuracy, which is what our regulators did with just horrific costs. I mean, and this is true on every. I was reading about how there's a kind of sunblock that has been available in Europe for the last 50 years. The FDA just got around to approving it. It's crazy. It's really crazy. Like they weren't working weekends and holidays as we were rushing to approve the vaccines. Thousands of people dying every day. So anyway, that's a criticism that libertarians have. That is very. I mean, this is a criticism lots of people have, but one that speaks to our philosophy that just big, unaccountable government there are so many mistakes that get made that are a product of large bureaucracies.
And I saw on your Twitter about the schools still being closed. That's a big issue. I mean, that's depriving the most vulnerable people of a basic right to an education.
Oh, it's horrible, and they are so, and it's not equal, right? Because private schools, so the wealthy have been able to get a normal-ish school experience since September. Private schools are open. Catholic schools around here in DC have been open basically the whole time, and they've actually had very few cases and no hospitalizations. So you can do this safely. The CDC has said we can do it safely. All evidence points to it being possible to do it safely. You have not seen super spreader events in schools, basically. It can be done. It's been proven that it can be done. And yet, because of the incentives, because the unions representing public teachers, public employees, are so powerful, nobody wants to defy them. And they've said, well, we would rather work from home. Why not? They're still getting paid. They don't have to, they don't have an incentive to go back to work because they're getting paid either way.
Maybe they are genuinely fearful. I mean, the news is pretty scary.
Certainly it's scary, but, everybody else has kind of had to go back to work. I mean, there's no, people cashiers in grocery stores, they're there. And we just had to make it work. Everybody else has had to make it work. And they've not, and they don't because they're getting paid regardless. And it's created really bad incentives. Private schools are open. A lot of colleges opened because they collect tuition. They're not going to get money automatically. They have customers. The public school system gets the money anyway, which just creates, so they don't really have an incentive to do what because the families can't say, well, you're not getting our money then, we're doing something else. Because it's taxes that pays for this. So the money's all being collected anyway. So there's no way to opt out of the system. There's no feedback mechanism for saying remote learning just doesn't work for us and we're not doing this. I mean, there are school districts in this country that get $15,000 in tax money per student that are right. They're still using that money to pay teachers that aren't teaching. What if every family instead just had, I'm not saying defund public education. You can still fund public education, but instead of giving that money to schools that are not meeting the needs of these families, what if just every kid got $15,000 and then you could get 5 of your friends together and you could have a little tutoring or a school for 5 or 6 kids and you could pay that teacher really, really well. It would work, but we don't have that option because it's non-voluntary. Yeah. So it's frustrating. It's very frustrating. And right now in Chicago, the school district has said it's as safe as it can be. We're starting to vaccinate teachers. It's great. And the teacher said, nope, we're not showing up.
Yeah.
Nearby in Fairfax, where I live in DC, the head of the teachers said, and I don't mean to, I like teachers. There are many teachers in my family. I'm sure many do want to go back to work. But the head of the teachers union said, they can't go back to school because the kids won't be vaccinated. But of course, the kids are never going to be vaccinated because the vaccines aren't approved for people under 16. So that just means we would never how could it be that school is the one thing we can never resume? That doesn't make any sense.
It's not cheerful, is it?
No, it's not. And it's not cheerful. I feel so bad for the kid. We're talking about mental trauma. I feel so bad for kids these days. When at the beginning I said, it's not a big deal to be out of school for a couple of weeks. The evidence shows that kids, they catch up rather quickly. If it's a small amount of time. Now it's been a full year for a lot of the most vulnerable kids. The kids in inner cities who are most reliant on public schools, who come from disadvantaged families, who don't have families that can, tutor them while they're doing their
internet as well. Often, have to pay.
Exactly, all that stuff. And you see these stories being reported of kids that everybody logs on day one. Then there's still maybe still 70% of the kids are logging on in week 4. But then eventually the kids are just not showing up. And the kids most likely to not show up are the ones who need this kind of education the most, who don't have strong family support, maybe because their family members are working, maybe because they're trying to put food on the table, maybe because resources are scarce. So that's for those kids. And then just all kids, they miss their friends. They miss their social lives. We had the Las Vegas school district recently decided to reopen and this is terrible. This is so terrible because there had been so many suicides among young people that because they miss school. And it's really, that's the horrible irony of the pandemic, which is that, COVID is thankfully not dangerous for kids nearly at all. They have much more favorable health outcomes from the disease than older. I mean, they have dramatically more favorable positive health outcomes. There are very, very few deaths among young people, but they're suffering. The kind of mitigation we've done is hurting them sort of the most, and no one speaks for them, and I feel so bad for them.
One of my other guests was Martin Kulldorff, one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, and I wrote a song for him called Pandemic Protocol, because they have the protocol before of what to do with the pandemic, but they just kind of ripped it up and locked everyone in their homes. So
and we don't. I feel like we weren't, and I understand that people are dying, and we can't just have life as normal while this is going on because the number of deaths is so unacceptable. But it's like we're not considering the trade-offs at all at some point. If we're not thinking about how, there's going to be an entire generation of young people with bad mental health outcomes, with much worse college attainment and employment prospects because of this. This is going to be worse than like the Great Recession or something like that, even in terms of a generation being held back. And we know we can open these schools safely now. We know that. That's the science. If you're one of those people that says, whatever the science says is what we must do, the science is pretty clear that we can open these schools or get people. I don't know, the government policy response, speaking to kind of what was discussed a little bit in the Great Barrington. I get. And I don't know that I would agree with everything that they say there, but the government's first impulse in so many places, shut down everything, close the beaches, close the parks, that kind of thing. But now we know that was all foolish because that part of it was very foolish because there's so little evidence of significant disease spread in outdoor spaces. No, we want people at the beaches. We want people at the parks. Go for a jog. Go outside. If you forbid outdoor social gatherings, then people are still going to get it's against human nature. People are still going to socialize. They're just going to do it in the more dangerous. We've not learned some of the lessons of prohibition. Every time you try to make something, we banned alcohol back in the early part of the 1900s. Well, but of course we didn't actually. We promoted organized crime as everyone becomes criminals, still engaging in this behavior. It's so contrary to human nature to tell people they can't socialize at all. And why we've not been able to draw a distinction between, obviously you can't have concerts, you can't have 100 people gatherings, but you know what? You should be able to, or it shouldn't be crazy to go see 5 or 10 people because you kind of have to for your own mental health. It's not to say there's no risks. but there's never no risks. I mean, driving a car carries some risks. Doing anything has some amount of risk. And the so many of the expert type planners seem to be tipping the scales so much on, there's no amount of risk that is acceptable when it comes to coronavirus. I mean, there are epidemiologists saying things like, even after everyone's vaccinated, we still have to do all the same mitigation strategies, have to wear, now it's not even one mask is not enough. Now you're supposed to wear like 2 masks over your face. And I'm like, well, what's the point then?
But let's come back full circle to panic attack then. Do you see this? Is this also influenced by this thinking?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the trend I kind of picked up in my book of people or trying to be angry or upset or feel emotional because there's a certain kind of power to it, is very much going on right now as people are locked down and people are frustrated. And I think some of their worst behavior is occurring. We've seen a lot of, we're talking a lot about cancel culture these days, the effort to really, dig up people's worst moments. What was that time you tweeted something really stupid? Can I get you fired for that? Can I get you expelled for that? I think so much of that behavior is because people are not meant to be trapped in their apartments all day, just like looking at with Twitter as their only outlet for human contact. It promotes the worst kind of policing of other people, a lot of shaming and that kind of thing, or wanting to feel morally superior, that I think festered a little bit on campuses to begin with, but has spilled out into the broader society in a very unhealthy and destructive way. It's hitting a lot of media companies. There's been so many, the New York Times having to, fire editors who ran op-eds that made people on their staff offended, that kind of thing. There's a lot of toxic drama in the newsroom workplace that is becoming more obvious. And because those people disproportionately come from the elite liberal arts background, they're those kinds of students I wrote about in my book, and now they're out in the real world demanding the same kind of unreasonable prohibitions on speech that offends them. That's what I've noticed. It's like the chickens are coming home to roost. It's not a problem confined to campus or student activism anymore, because they grow up, right? And they didn't grow up and change their thinking. They grew up to make all of the rest of us live under it.
You said that one of the underlying causes that they want to feel protected, that they wanted their universities to make them feel like home and protect them. And do you think the virus is also a threat, and they want to wear 3 masks to feel like, and they should be protected? The government should protect them.
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely. I think there's right, because when you're on campus, they thought it's the job of the administration to make them feel safe and protected at all times. When you're not on the campus, whose job is it to make you feel safe and protected at all times? It's your employer, maybe in a certain context. So then, and this is happening all the time, this is the new HR crisis, is problems at work where someone says something that someone disagrees with or is offensive, and they want that person fired, and they'll say it's a matter of their own personal safety. This is happening all the time now. So it's your employer, and then it's the government, right? It's the authority in society is supposed to make you feel perfectly safe and perfectly protected at all times. No wonder they're recommending people walk around, even by and again, I'm not trying to be, I know there are certain precautions we need to take, but my God, there's no evidence. If you're outside walking your dog on the street by yourself, there is no risk of spreading COVID-19 to anyone. There's no risk of it through incidental contact. If you walk past someone, unless you spit in their face, you're not going to, this is crazy. And they're saying, well, you should wear 3 masks to prevent that. I mean, there's a difference between being in a crowded indoor space or even a crowded outdoor space and just passing someone on the sidewalk that is not being, and we're acting like there's no difference, because people are in it, to my mind, an absurd mindset of needing a level of safety that is unreasonable.
So you think it's part of the same thinking strain that now the whole world is shut down because of these trends that you identified? Yeah,
we are it's part of a long historical trend toward over valuing safety. Even in terms of like parenting norms, right?
Yeah.
If you go back 100 years, a family has 12 kids, and maybe half of them are going to live to adulthood. Maybe. If they show up for dinner, they get fed. If they don't show up for dinner, well, then you don't get fed. Like, they weren't keeping track of where their kids were at all times. Now families have fewer kids, and they're already planning their college admissions essays. When they're 5 years old, they're like, oh no, you had to stay after school today? Well, this is going to infect your long-term employment prospects. And to some degree, they're not crazy to think this way, because we become so punitive, and things can now be held against you that you did wrong when you were like an infant. Kids aren't allowed to play by themselves anymore to nearly the same degree. It used to. Now parents are arrested for letting their kids walk home from school by themselves or be unsupervised for any amount of time. And it's not. I think the idea behind that is that they're going to be kidnapped or it's unsafe. But actually, it's like become much more safe, just in general in America, at least.
Yeah.
The height of violent crime was in the 80s, and so our parents were kids with much more freedom at a time of much higher danger, like public safety in that sense. And today, parents are afraid to let their kids do anything, either because they're fearful or they think they're going to get in trouble, or people will shame them, saying, "Oh, I can't believe you don't watch your kids at every moment of every day." So part of it is.
So what's the reason behind it? Is it the media, or is it because there's less children that are only having?
I blame the media. I greatly blame the media, because if you watch local news, local news is conditioned to freak you out, right? Is like, oh, there's a sex offender and someone got killed and there was a stabbing or there was a kidnapping. If it bleeds, it leads. So there's no news there's never news, another sunny day where no one died and everything was good. And outside the pandemic, obviously we wouldn't have those stories right now because everything's bad. But in normal times, crime has most people think, because they've surveyed this, most people think crime is always rising. And actually violent crime has risen in the last year or two at least. But they've always thought this. The violent crime rate fell in half from 1993 to like 2005 or 6, somewhere around there. It got a lot safer. And people don't know that, because local news is all, and national news, cable news, all sorts of news is all designed to scare you and to freak you out. Most people think if they leave their kids alone for 5 seconds, they're going to get kidnapped. There's a white van is going to show up, and the sex traffickers are going to grab them, and that's it. Goodbye, little Sally, little Johnny. That never happens, like statistically, ever. In fact, that criminologists know this, that virtually all kidnappings, it's a family member in a custody dispute, or it's a runaway, or it's the stranger coming and abducting your child. It happens, but it is it's like the 1.1% of occurrences. It's not a reasonable fear, and yet we've totally reoriented society and how much freedom children have because of how the media has overhyped that fear.
To parents, bred Generation Z to be fearful of most everything unconsciously. Helicopter parents lack basic bravery onto unsuspecting offspring. They load their anxieties. To parents, the media's to blame. In their rush to ratings, they push kidnapping claims. Helicopter parents were arrested if they didn't provide a home environment that was safety sufficient. Table bolstered the fable, abduction from strangers and never breathe the fear of missing kids on milk cartons. All of their descendants have panic in their veins. At the slightest provocation, they feel emotional pain. These kids are adolescents at university, and even Halloween costumes cause them anxiety. They're on antidepressants cause the pressure is immense. Free speech needs to be constrained for their self-defense. Cause of their suppressants, they need safety at all costs. They're asking to be treated in the way that they grew up. The breakfast table bolstered the fable, abduction from strangers and never-present danger. Whose bright idea was to breathe the fear of missing kids on milk cartons?
Did you spoke to Congress about one statistical exaggeration, no?
I spoke to Congress about. I testified about hate crimes, actually, which is a little bit related to some of the things we've talked about. It was a House committee meeting on civil rights and civil liberties, and there's an idea that hate crimes are rising every year. That there's more crimes against racial minorities, women, Jewish people, gay people, etc. The issue is the tallying of hate crimes is very imprecise because it's voluntary and local police departments do it, and it's not required. So it could just be every year the police do like a little bit better job of actually counting hate crimes, so they submit more information. So then it looks like the problem's getting worse, but actually it was just as bad before. They weren't paying as much attention. The more there's an extent to which better tallying or better surveying of a problem will make the problem seem worse, even though it just means you were doing a bad job before.
Like measuring more COVID cases.
Yeah, no, it's exactly like that. Yeah. And also it's the hate crime is a little bit of a murky definition because of the US free speech issues. So you can't, it's bad to hate people because they're black or they're gay or they're a Jewish person. It's not illegal. It's absolutely protected. But if you assault someone and you assaulted a black person and you yelled a racial epithet, well, then they might be able to charge you with a hate crime. There has to be an underlying criminal behavior. So you have to assault or murder or vandalism or something. And then there can be an additional hate crime charge. But even that I find a little bit, it's starting to get into some, free speech issues like, well, should they really be able to, according to our First Amendment, should they be able to actually give you an additional penalty because of your ideology as you committed this crime? Is it really worse in some sense because you committed, what is the reason? Assault is assault. And certainly judges and juries can decide that this assault is worse than this one for this reason. And I support that. And that's always existed. But having it be where the law itself, the statute says one is worse than the other, is actually taking flexibility away from judges and juries. And then also there's a double jeopardy issue because there's a federal hate crime law. So then it's like you have to plead guilty because you're going to be convicted. This is just the problem in general. Everyone accepts a plea deal. No one goes to trial because the mandatory sentence is so high that you can't risk it. And the more laws on the books, the worse this problem gets. So we have in the overwhelming majority of cases, people will accept a plea deal from the prosecutor for less time and some penalty. So people don't actually get to argue their innocence because they can't, because the mandatory penalty, if you're convicted, is so high, which to my mind has certain due process issues with it. So those are I talked about some of these problems with the hate crime laws before Congress.
Oh, what you say makes so much sense. I didn't know I was a libertarian, but I think I might be.
That's great. That's what we like to hear.
Yeah.
And again, obviously, we need laws to put away people who commit violent crimes. But you can do that without really monitoring the kind of the thinking on the front end. And actually, Europe has hate crime laws where it's actually just the thought of hate is the crime. Like there are UK cases of people writing offensive or posting offensive song lyrics that contain racial epithets on Facebook and having the cops show up, which is, to my mind, crazy. And that is something that is absolutely prohibited. That cannot happen in the US because of the First Amendment.
Okay. Yeah, there's lots of censorship with, Twitter and Facebook, and so...
Yeah, and that causes a whole bunch of... so the book I'm writing right now is about social media regulation and free speech issues.
Ah, okay.
Which is interesting because... so if Twitter's a private company, and Facebook's a private company, so the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. So they can delete your post or kick you off or do whatever they want. It's not a First Amendment problem because it's their company. They can treat you unfairly. They can just block all people they can do... that's their right. It's their company. So I would never say, and part of the point of my book is to short circuit the idea that the government should regulate these companies to require them to have certain policies. Now, that's not to say I have to like their policies, and they frequently make moderation decisions I think are wrong. And I have criticized. Did
you agree with Trump getting taken off?
I absolutely think he should have been taken off in the initial suspension. The decision to keep him off permanently, which is, I believe, what's occurred on Twitter, and Facebook is currently deciding whether to keep him off permanently. I don't know that he should be kept off permanently. I think taking him to the brief suspension was totally called for. I'm not quite sold on the permanent expulsion. And part of it is the hypocrisy, and this is just a problem with social media regulation in general, right? You can always find 20 examples of the policy not being applied. Why is the Ayatollah of Iran still, who tweets, calls to attack Israel or something like that, it's still on Twitter. The Chinese Communist Party is still tweeting things about how the Uyghur Muslims are treated. That you can find lots of foreign heads of state. If Trump is violating these policies, they're certainly violating these policies, probably to a greater extent. So why them and not them? Which again is not. It's the company's right to engage in unequal treatment of these various entities, but I think people are perfectly justified in speaking up about them and not liking them. And also, I worry about purging. In the same sense, if it were public, if it were the government doing it, I still do worry about purging all edgy or offensive or vile content from these major platforms, because then they just go to platforms like Telegram or others that are less monitored. There was this great study about how ISIS is very ineffective because members of ISIS are always posting about their plans on Facebook, and they're easily apprehended when they do that. From a law enforcement standpoint, the best thing is for all sorts of terrorism, right-wing, left-wing, Islamic, whatever you're talking about, to be planned in the open on Facebook, and for everyone to take selfies while they're planning it, so then they can all be caught. Yeah. Forcing all these people onto the more encrypted services does have some downsides, so we should all keep that in mind.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, all the people who attacked the Capitol, we've arrested like 300 of them because they're all live streaming them doing it. They're taking pictures of themselves committing crimes and saying, "I'm in the Capitol committing this crime," which is great from the FBI standpoint.
Yeah. God, if they can't solve that case, then there's no hope for them.
Yeah, those are some pretty open and shut cases.
Yeah. And so, what's the new book called?
It'll be called Tech Panic. Panic theme. Yeah, and the 2-sentence summary of it is that while I share some concerns that people have with social media, I'm wary of regulation. Also because there's a lot of good stuff about social media. We're always talking about the downsides, and there are some downsides. But man, over the last year, I don't know what I would have done without it. In a year where we were literally prohibited from seeing people, from engaging in human interaction. I mean, it's not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but thank goodness you have some way to keep in touch with people that outside of like writing them letters or calling them on the phone or something. Social media really is tremendous in how much more connected it makes. The ability to talk across such vast distances, like what we're doing right now, should not be, that should not be shrugged off. That is an amazing, amazing thing. So I don't ever want to lose sight of the positives of it, even as people talk about, well, what about addiction? Well, what about political bias? Well, what about sex trafficking or whatever the issue is? Well, some of those we need to address, some of those we don't, but let's not come up with some punitive new legal regime that just, shuts down. I mean, they're talking in U.S. Congress. They talk, both Republicans and Democrats, both sides have talked about shutting down or breaking up Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. Again, there are problems with some of these companies, but to the large extent, they provide people with a service that they love very cheaply or for free that it's hard to imagine living without. And I'm not sure I trust Facebook more than I trust the US Congress, that's for sure.
But are you in the middle on every issue, do you find yourself?
Yeah, it's sort of, I end up on the middle on average, even though it's not like every opinion I have is a moderate opinion. I think I have some very strong ideological commitments and aggressive views. But since I have them on both sides, I sort of end up looking like some kind of moderate.
So what about gun rights, for example?
So libertarians tend to be supportive of gun rights. Just as they are everything. Libertarians think you should be able to smoke marijuana. Libertarians believe you should be able to be in a same-sex relationship. Libertarians believe you should be able to own guns. You should be able to own heroin. You should be able to own anything, really, is sort of the libertarian default. And then sometimes you say, okay, well, what are the reasonable limitations government has to put on
automatic weapons? And
some of these things, right. My main, so I wouldn't personally, I would not say, like, guns are not my signature issue by any stretch of the imagination. The point I would make about guns is that I think a lot of the proposals to regulate or restrict them wouldn't actually reduce the kinds of crime that people are so upset at. Like, we always talk about mass shootings or how there's so many mass shootings. But it seems like while mass shootings are horrifying, there's such a low amount of total gun crime. Total gun crime is like one-off homicides, often gang-related in major cities, which are all the guns are already out there. So if you restricted the new gun supply, we have so many guns in this country.
I know, it's crazy.
It is totally crazy. I don't know that new restrictions, even on the real, the assault rifles or the really like scary high-powered weapons. Yeah, but most people are being shot by like a handgun or something that was held by someone on the street, or they're suicides. So that's the other issue with this. The majority, I think it's the majority, it's the near majority of gun deaths are suicides. That is actually an area where I guess if you could have some restrictions that might reduce that. There might be restrictions I would be inclined to support if you can show me that here's how this would actually reduce crime or violence or something. It's not nearly as simple as saying, well, we need this restriction and then we would, because there's so many guns out there. And also the other issue is every time you create a new law, if you say that, okay, people can't own this kind of gun anymore, or they can't purchase it, or they have to turn it in if they have that. Well, just like alcohol prohibition or drug prohibition or anything else, there's going to be tons of people who do this anyway, who now you're making it a law enforcement issue. You're driving it underground, and then there becomes all this violent crime associated with this product now being illegal. I mean, especially after a year where we talk about Black Lives Matter, where we talk about, the police, knocking down people's doors and going into their homes on search warrants, that kind of thing. We know that the police are disproportionate impact of law enforcement falls on communities of color, for instance. That's going to be the same thing if you criminalize guns to a greater extent. It's going to exacerbate that trend heavily. You're going to have even more policing of poor Black people with guns, and there's going to be more deaths like George Floyd's or Breonna Taylor's or whatever. That will be a consequence of this. So maybe that's a consequence worth making, but we need to carefully consider the policy.
One comedian said, just make bullets very, very expensive.
Yeah, make bullets very, very expensive. But then there will be a black market in bullets, right? There will be some gang that has bullets. Just like, making drugs illegal hasn't helped get rid of them in this country at all. You can't even get drugs out of prisons. We have drugs in prisons in the U.S. It's a currency of gangs in prisons. It is access to hard drugs, to hard narcotics. So at some point, it's like, even if it would be ideal, if I could wave a magic wand and then all the guns in America go poof, maybe that would be good, but I clearly can't do that. All we can do is enforce it with the tools we have, and trying to do this to any other substance or commodity or technology or thing that a lot of people want to have seems to fail, and fail rather spectacularly. So anyway, that's my long answer. It's more of a practical opposition to serious efforts to regulate guns.
And do a quick answer on healthcare, because that's a terrible situation in America. I mean, what did you think of Obamacare? And
I am. You have to pick something you're just not that well informed about, because there's only so much time. I do not consider myself a healthcare expert at all. Our system is very dysfunctional. There were problems with the existing system. There are problems with Obamacare. There are problems with what they're proposing now. Which is better than the other? I'm frankly not quite sure. I know one of the concern I would have with Obamacare is that it turned out not to be true, right? When President Obama said, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. It turned out that was not true, because there were a lot of people who had plans that they were perfectly happy with, but the government deemed substandard that no longer existed under Obamacare. So there were people losing the health insurance they were perfectly satisfied with, or they were satisfied with not having health insurance, or whatever the case may be, and their situation was then made illegal by Obamacare. Now, our existing system had so many problems that Obamacare was also good for probably a lot of people. I think our link between employment and health insurance is probably bad. Most people in America get it through, it's provided through your job, and it's not, and it being insurance is a problem too, because nobody knows what they're paying for with health insurance, because it's confusing it's billed to the insurance company, and then you see some confusing bill, but you're just paying a copay or something. Everything where prices are distorted to the customer ends up being ridiculously expensive, because the doctor can just charge, because there's no natural price. So the doctor can charge, okay, it's $10,000 for a root canal, whatever, but the insurance company is paying the $10,000. Well, maybe now it's $20,000. It's not you're not paying. If you were paying, then you go, well, I'm not going to pay for this. I'm going to a dentist who only charges some sane amount for that. Do you know what I mean? There's not a consumer feedback mechanism because of how it works. It's not like I know how much bananas cost, and if bananas are too expensive at Giant, I go to Kroger. That is not the case with medical care at all. And that's not really a problem. That's a problem. It's not one that Obamacare was even really trying to grapple with. It might not even be one that can be fixed at this point. So I don't know. I'm not opposed to, helping people, the government helping people who can't afford healthcare or anything. I tend to say, if an issue is certain people don't have access to something, yeah, sure, maybe the government needs to provide it for them. but that's better than the government having some like punitive rule for everyone or something. Or just give people money. Then we can just give them some kind of pay rather than, or like minimum wage is an idea I hate. Why force companies that maybe can't afford to pay people more money? Why punish them if people don't have, if the truly poor, why don't you directly subsidize them? Why don't you just send them checks or something? Rather than, it feels like it's tinkering and it's like making companies jump through hoops to do it that way. That's I'm more toward universal basic income, I think, is a better idea than minimum wage or something like that.
Okay. Wow, it's such a wide-ranging conversation we've had. It's been really great.
Yeah, this was super fun. I talk a lot, so
no, you've got. So, but with this podcast, I have to focus on one thing to write a song about our conversation.
That's so cool.
What do you think? I've covered some of these issues before in other songs. But what do you think you would draw out? What message is most important for you to get across?
I don't know. I'm really interested to see, what you come up with. We did go in like so many different directions. So feel free to focus on whatever you want. I mean, the spirit that animates me is just one for, individual freedom and broad sanity and wariness of moral panic or going too far with some government policy or something like that.
That's a very libertarian answer. Write whatever you want.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Well, who am I to tell you? Do whatever you want.
Yeah, you're 100% libertarian. I can't find any fault in you. Yeah.
Wonderful.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Robby.
My pleasure. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
At college, he was cruelly isolated. His ideology set him alone. Republicans had fun and the best parties, well, the old left ran the place to feel like home. Oh, we're on the edges with him in the middle. Only years later, he found his tribe, a group whose values he recognized. They formed a circle with him in the middle. He's a libertarian and been set free. He says it loud, he sings it proud. At last I've found my crown. I'm a libertarian and I belong. I'm coming up, I'm coming clean. This is what I believe. Yes to giving all a voice. Yes to more freedom of choice. Yes to work deregulation. Yes to peace with other nations. Yes to bureaucratic reduction. Yes to the virtue of production. Yes, autonomy, less authority. Yes to freedom's our priority. I'm a libertarian, the third way. Two parties is no choice when we all need to have a voice. Libertarians become free. I'm coming up, I'm coming clean. This is what I believe. Yes to giving all a voice. Yes to more freedom of choice. Yes to work deregulation. Yes to peace with other nations. Yes to bureaucratic reduction. Yes to the virtue of production. Yes, autonomy, less authority. Yes to freedom's our priority.
Thanks for tuning in. As always, please like, subscribe, share, do anything you can to help promote the show. If you want to hear the song again, you can go to Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, etc. Stream it there, or buy it for $1 on Podsongs.com. This will help support my musicians, Maurizio Sarnicola, Massimino Vozza, and my researcher, Dori Verbo. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.